losses continued to mount to levels where pilots began to wonder if they were strapping into their cockpit or their coffin. Over 100 THUD pilots would spend close to 7 years in innocuous Vietnamese prisons.
In 1966, I volunteered to go back TDY and finish up my 100 missions. And on June 29th, 1966, I was one of a handful of us that were selected to hit Hanoi for the first time. And we had bombed all over North Vietnam for all those years. But on this particular day, President Johnson had personally approved an attack within the 30-mile radius of Hanoi. And our target that day was a Hanoi POL. There were 24 F-105s taking part in this raid. The Navy was doing the same type of target at Haiphong that day, but the Air Force had Hanoi. We were divided up into 6 flights of 4, stupid tactics, all flying the same route, 5 minutes apart. And the Vietnamese had time to take a break between flights. I happened to be in the last flight flying the number 2 position that day. We were carrying 8 750-pound bombs. When we crossed into North Vietnam from Laos, in the last 50 miles in, it was nothing but anti-aircraft fire. Tactic was to come in at about 6,000 feet. We were doing 540 knots ground speed. It's about 620 miles an hour. We were in spread formation, and the radar warning gear was so loud, I actually turned the volume down that day. As we went in, they fired a missile. We were about 5 miles from our pop-up point, and we quickly dropped down to 1,000 feet. And we're at 1,000 feet coming in, and just as leader popped, and I was about to pop up to go to 12,000 feet and roll in at a 45-degree dive, I suddenly took a hit with what I believe was an 85 millimeter. I was watching the 6-gun emplacement off to my 10 o'clock position, and I could see the rounds going off around me. And suddenly I took a direct hit just in front of the cockpit. I was in a slight right bank, and the round hit just under my feet, coming up into the cockpit. The whole bottom of the airplane disappeared. Fire was starting to come up. I had shrapnel on both legs. A piece of shrapnel had actually taken my oxygen mask off my face. Tried to eject, canopy wouldn't come off. I had the only unmodified airplane at Tak Lee, didn't have the rocket seat. I jammed the handles back down, and I can still feel those handles, the strength that I pull them to this day. I pulled with everything I had. The canopy still didn't go, and I squeezed the triggers and went through the canopy in a 90-degree bank, still doing 540 knots. And I figure I was about 300 feet above the ground. Parachute open. I never swung. I hit the ground, still decelerating on a 45-degree angle, and probably bounced 10, 15 feet in the air when I hit. Came back down on my head, which is probably the safest thing for me. Fell back on my knees. There was a slight breeze. The parachute was still inflated a little bit and was kind of tugging me backwards, and I'm trying to get out of it. I looked up, and about 100 yards away were about 30 North Vietnamese soldiers with AK-47s running toward me. We're just on the north side of Hanoi, near Gia Lam airfield. Pull my trusty 45 automatic that I had on my right hip, had it in my right hand over my head, and I was trying to reach up with my left arm to grab the quick disconnects to release the canopy so I could stop being pulled backwards. And I couldn't get it, and I couldn't understand why, and I looked down at my left side, and my arm was completely broken about 3 inches below the shoulder. Shoulder was dislocated, and the arm was just flopping back and forth, and the nub was moving up and down. I jammed the pistol back, released the canopy, pulled the pistol. First guy was maybe 10, 15 yards away, and I cocked it level down on him, and when I did that, they all dropped on the ground and leveled their AKs toward me. And I guess at that point I decided it wasn't John Wayne. I uncocked it, stuck my hand up in the air, the butt of it out toward the first guy. He grabbed the pistol, raised my hand over my head. Of course, couldn't raise the left one. One of the other soldiers came running up and grabbed the left arm, and he put it in a hammerlock. Now, I'm a big guy, and I was in a lot better shape back in those days, having played football, played center and linebacker at Tulane. And I hit this guy harder than I've ever hit anybody in my life, and I shattered his face. I could see the bone, I could see blood went everywhere, cartilage. And he went down, and they got very excited, and I thought they were going to shoot me, and I'm flopping the arm around and pointing to it with my right hand, and they realized the arm was broken. And they put a rope around my neck, they stripped me of all my clothes, left me standing in a pair of white undershorts and a white t-shirt. Nobody spoke English. The one interesting thing that happened there, two guys in a blue uniform came up, and I think they were political commissars, and they pointed to me in sort of a pointy-talky language. They said Rusky, and they were asking me if I were Russian. I said no. My head was bleeding pretty badly. Vietnamese woman in uniform with a little Red Cross bag put a bandage on my head, and that was the extent of the medical attention. As it turned out, I had 6 broken vertebrae. Both my ACLs and my knees were torn, shrapnel on both legs, dislocated shoulder, the broken arm, and lots of cuts and bruises. They put me in a small vehicle. We went a short distance, maybe a quarter of a mile, to a group of 3 houses. And they put me in this one, sat there, and maybe 20 minutes later, English-speaking interrogator, an officer, and 3 soldiers from the Hanoi Hilton arrived. They replaced the 3 guys. They locked the door. People are looking in, watching this, and he said, I'm going to ask you some questions. If you do not answer, you'll be severely punished. At that time, I said, I'm badly injured. He said, later, what is your name? I gave that to him. He said, what is your rank? I said, captain. And then he said, what base did you take off from? I said, I can't tell you that. I can only give you my name, rank, serial number, date of birth, according to the Geneva Agreements. He didn't say anything else to me. He said something in Vietnamese. Soldiers standing behind me on the right kicked me upside the head, knocked me over. They grabbed the broken arm, dragged me out in the middle of the floor, and when they did that, they at least relocated the shoulder, put the arm in a hammerlock, tied my ankles tightly with ropes, put my arms behind my back, tied the wrists very tight with ropes, then pulled the elbows together and tied them at the elbows till the elbows were touching. And then they put another rope but from the ankles up to the rope that was around the elbows and pulled me up backwards. And they started kicking and beating. This went on, I'm guessing, 2 or 3 hours. And finally, in answer to the question, what base did you take off from? I said, Tak Le. He said, Tak Le Air Base, Thailand. I said, yes. What squadron? I wouldn't tell him. After a while, I said 333rd. He said 333rd Tactical Fighter Squadron, and I said, yes. And then he said 355th Tactical Fighter Wing. I said, yes. They knew all this information. And he said, what was your target? Well, smoke was up to 20 or 30,000 feet from the target. And I said, you ought to know you drove right past it to come get me. And he didn't say anything else. Got up, went outside, and was gone maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Came back and said something in Vietnamese. They untied my arms, led me outside with a rope around my neck, made me kneel on the ground. One of the soldiers walked up behind me and he stuck his rifle to the back of my head. Stood there a couple seconds and pulled the trigger on the empty chamber. What do you think when you think you're going to die? I really didn't care at that point. It was hurting so bad. This is over about 5 hours. And then I said, you know, they're not going to kill me. But when I heard the click, the funniest thought went through my mind. I said, damn, that's a slow bullet. I didn't know whether I was dead or just waiting for something to feel. And then 3 photographers came out of a building, took some pictures and movies of me there. And they took me back inside afterwards, retied the arms the same way, or put a blindfold on me this time, and then led me out to a big Russian army truck. And about 6 or 7 guys picked me up like a sack of potatoes, and they swung me 2 or 3 times up into the back of the truck. It really hurt when I came down on the broken arm. And maybe 20 minutes later, we were at the Hanoi Hilton. I'd been shot down at noon, so they continued the same type of torture and beatings until around 7 o'clock that night. And they brought in a clean flying suit, which was not mine. They had a huge pair of Navy flying boots. Said, put these on, you're going to a press conference. They put them on me, gave me a little piece of gauze to use as a sling, which they would take away after this little parade and press conference. Led me out the main gate, and we would take about an hour ride through a part of Hanoi that was filled with the Vietnamese that lived there, throwing bricks, rocks, whatever they could. One big intersection, the truck stalled and the crowd started climbing up on the truck, and they actually turned their bayonets toward the crowd to keep them off. We ended up at the International House where they're having this huge press conference. They kept me out in kind of a courtyard, and I hadn't had anything to drink. And since I had been shot down, I was thirsty, and I said, I need some water. They said later, I said, I'm not going anywhere until I get some water. Well, I ended up getting a large glass of water with ice in it, which I drank, and that would be the last water for 2 days. And then they took me in. My thoughts were, don't embarrass my country. I felt I'd already failed by giving them any information whatsoever. And all there was name, rank, and so forth. But I just felt like I had let my country down, and I wasn't going to do it in front of these cameras. So I walked in, stood up as straight as I could, and saluted. And I guess this film was later used at our jungle survival school in the Philippines, and people that saw it were told, say, see, this is the way you should conduct yourself. Even the Vietnamese appreciate military bearing. Well, that wasn't true, because I had the devil beat out of me that night and for the next 10 days at the Hanoi Hilton. What did they want to know? They want to know when we were coming back to Hanoi and what targets we were going to bomb. I had no idea, because this was proved all the way up to the White House. And this was a JCS target. And finally, after several days, I said, all right, give me a map. And I marked every intersection, every town I could on there, not knowing anything, whether they were targets or not. Just gave them a bunch of junk. The other thing they wanted to know was who were the pilots in my squadron. And I lied. I said, I don't know. I just got there last night. I don't know any of the guys. And they kept on, and finally I gave them some names like Clark Kent, Superman, Joe Friday. They wrote all of that stuff down. If they ever shot anybody but now that was named Clark Kent or Joe Friday, they probably would have beaten the devil out of them, but I didn't think that was going to happen. And I think I wasn't the only one that did it. Lots of the prisoners did it. Well, on the 9th day, I really broke. I gave up totally. Physically, spiritually, mentally, because I finally signed a confession they put in front of me. I still remember it, word for word. I condemn the United States government for its aggressive war against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. 2, I've encroached upon the airspace of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. 3, I am a war criminal. And 4, I have received humane and lenient treatment from the Vietnamese people and government. I signed that. They put me in a cell in the Hanoi Hilton in a little section we call Heartbreak Hotel. I was in cell 4, 90 inches by 90 inches, 2 concrete bunks, leg irons embedded in the bunks. My right leg had become badly infected from the shrapnel, no medical attention. Maggots were starting to form on it. It was turning black. And on that 9th day, a female guard came in and she looked at the leg and she pulled something off, stuff shot out of it. She screamed and left, came back with a pitcher of hot tea and started pouring the hot tea on there. I guess the tannic acid is supposed to have some medicinal purpose. I very politely asked her to leave using a lot of 4-letter words. About an hour later, I saw my first medic, with the doctor. He looked at the leg, shook his head, he didn't speak English. Came back with the interrogator, and they talked, and he said, "Your leg is very bad, we must cut it off." And I said, "No, you're not gonna cut my leg off, I'd rather die." So Neil Jones gave up, and I wanted to die. That night, this is on the 9th night, they put a guy in the cell next to me. I'd only talked to one other American who was on the other side up toward the top, or the entrance, and Paul Galante had been shot down a few days before me, just long enough to exchange names. Guard came and we had to stop talking because they would torture you if you started talking to someone. Anyway, they put a guy in the cell next to me in cell 3. No sooner had the guard left when the voice came out, "Where's Neil Jones?" And I tell you what, just hearing my name by another American, I must have bounced a foot off that bunk. And I said, "Right here, who's that?" And the voice came back to Neil, "This is Dave Hatcher." Dave Hatcher was a good friend, a captain, F-105 pilot. Dave was shot down, at least 30 days before I was. And we didn't know what had happened to him, whether he was alive or dead. And I said, "My God, Dave, you don't know how good it is to hear your voice. How did you know I was here?" He said, "Well, I was in a camp near here called the Zoo, and we have loudspeakers in each cell. And every morning and every night they play the Voice of Vietnam, or Hanoi Hana, as we call it. It was the 30-minute propaganda broadcast in English aimed to the soldiers in South Vietnam." He said, "The same day you were shot down, they announced that night. So at least I knew my family knew I was alive." I asked Dave how he was, and he said he was fine. And then he asked me how I was, and I said, "Dave, I think I'm going to die." He said, "There's only one thing to do, and that's to pray a lot." I pray all the time. Well, I prayed that night, not for why me, God, but give me the strength to do what I have to do. And I finally slept a little that night, and I woke up the next day and I knew I was going to make it out of there, and never gave up after that. I found out 4 years later that Dave had just been tortured when he told me that. And he happened to be in the large group that was paraded through Hanoi, and the crowd got out of hand and a lot of guys were beat in that. But my raid had precipitated the other march, but he never said anything to me. But I had the opportunity to tell Dave thanks in Washington, D.C. at the White House. He had his daughter, and I told her how his dad had saved my life that night. But anyway, the next night they moved Dave and I and 2 other guys, Paul Galante and somebody else who I didn't know the name of, to the zoo, and I would stay there for the next 4.5 years in that camp. But I go back and I look at the guys that I flew with, the guys that I was in prison with, a bunch of band of brothers. He who sheds his blood with me shall forever be my brother. They're the best friends I've ever had. Those that I flew with, those that are in prison. One thing I learned, one of my dearest friends in my whole life, is a guy named Vic Viscera. Vic and I checked out the THUD together. We're at Japan, the same squadron. flew to combat together. He escorted my wife and 2 young kids back to the United States. Never forgot that, and appreciate it more than anybody knows. But band of brothers.
And see the entire film now streaming on Amazon and Tubi TV. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment below so as not to miss new upcoming videos. Thanks for watching.